Okay, Bakher Ben, my Kurdish friends, and welcome to everybody else. So my name is Raha Medhat, and I will be your host for today. So today we're gathered here to talk about poverty and homelessness in Ontario, but specifically in Toronto. Before we begin, however, I have a question for you, just by a show of hand and with free of judgment. Raise your hand if you are most of the time willing to offer change to a homeless person. I personally was never the type. I always second guessed myself and would hesitate to give change, but if you are the type of person who usually gives change to homeless people when you see them on the street, please raise your hand. So I think with, like most people, a lot of people hesitate to give change because of stigmas around homeless people and stereotypes around homeless people that they will use that money for drugs or for alcohol or for things that are not necessities. However, like I said, this is a stereotype. These are things that people think about homeless people, but usually that's not the case. I want to share a personal story. About a month ago, I was downtown Toronto with my friends, and I noticed a young homeless man who was asking for money on the streets, and being the type of person that had that way of thinking about homeless people, of not giving them change because they might use it for the wrong things, I instinctively, without even thinking, just took whatever change I had in my pocket and gave it to him without thinking. And I thought that, oh, why did I just do that? That was weird, because normally I don't believe in that. But I'm so glad that I did, because that got me, can you all hear me properly?
Yes.
That got me chatting with him. For some reason, I started asking him questions. Well, where do you live, and how did you end up here, and what's your name, how old are you? And I found out that this young man, Cal, that was his name, was 22 years old. He didn't have a family. His parents had abandoned him. He couldn't finish high school, but he found a way to complete 1 year at U of T for civil engineering. He was able to do a test where he was accepted into the school. Like, he was that smart that he was able to complete 1 year at U of T, at the University of Toronto, in civil engineering, but couldn't continue because he didn't have money. He didn't have a place to live. He lives in a tent somewhere on the streets of Toronto. And I thought that was the saddest thing I had ever heard. This young man with so much potential and so much drive. He had just gotten a job with a moving company just under the table, and for some reason I felt propelled to tell him that I believed in him and that he could do so much more, and that I knew that he would make it far. And so my point in sharing this story is that before we judge anybody, specifically, especially homeless people, you need to remind yourself that at the end of the day, these are human beings, just like you and I, and there are circumstances and that brought them to that situation, and they have a story. And if you just sit 2 minutes with them just to ask them what their story is, I think your perspective on homelessness and poverty will change drastically. So that was my little spiel on homelessness, personal story. But now I would like to introduce you John Clarke. He is the one who will be informing you on the situation in Ontario. John Clarke is an organizer with Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. He's been organizing with this coalition in poor communities to resist poverty and austerity for the last 25 years. So please, without further ado, I would like for you all to welcome Mr. Clarke.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if I need to bend down into this thing. I think everyone can probably hear me quite well. So yes, I'm an organiser with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, and we were formed in November of 1990. So we've been around for quite a while. And I'll tell you some of the organising work that we've done and some of the ways in which we've tried to fight back against an agenda of poverty and austerity. When we speak of poverty in the city of Toronto, we are of course talking about a city that is incredibly wealthy. Toronto is the largest centre of wealth in Canada, which is itself a G7 country, which is to say an imperialist country. And yet, while in this city there is an incredible amount of wealth, with some 40% of the world's mining capital being raised on the stock exchange in this city, while you have such wealth, you also have you might say world-class poverty. You actually have a situation where there are enormous numbers of people living in grossly inadequate housing conditions. The largest landlord in the country is Toronto Community Housing, the public housing authority. And they are boarding up units because they are in such a state of disrepair that they are becoming uninhabitable. They are talking in terms of, in the next 5 years, half of the housing stock becoming critical because of a lack of basic repairs. There are over 4,000 people every night crowding into homeless shelters. There are tens of thousands of people who must turn to food banks in order to feed themselves and their families. Recently, under great community pressure, the City of Toronto agreed to issue figures on the number of homeless people who die. And the first of those figures has just come out, showing that there will be this year over 100 homeless deaths in the City of Toronto. And the striking thing about it is that in this country, the average life expectancy, with a slight difference between men and women, the average life expectancy for people in this country is about 80 years. The average age at which a homeless person dies in Toronto is 51, which gives a sense of the incredible assault on people's health that is being inflicted by this situation. And this in a place that is immensely wealthy. So I think it's important to understand that. OCAP, when it was formed, really was formed in a context of a mounting agenda of what we today would call austerity, neoliberal austerity. And the years in which we've been operating have been years in which we have been fighting a mounting agenda of attack and austerity. And it has been really for a purpose. There has been what you might call a war on the poor. But in this capitalist society, a war on the poor is only a component part of a bigger attack on the whole working class population. At the end of the post-war years, when the boom came to an end in the late 60s, early 70s, a new strategy emerged of what we today would call neoliberalism. And they wanted, of course, to increase the rate of exploitation of workers. And they realised that one of the important things that they needed to do in order to facilitate that was to make the situation of those people who were outside of the workforce even more desperate and inadequate than it had already been. And this was an international drive. The infamous Chicago School of Economics that Milton Friedman taught out of, a couple of economists from there in 1974 wrote a piece in which they said, why is it that today in 1974 unemployment levels in the United States are higher than they have been at any time since the Great Depression, and yet wages are not falling. And the conclusion they reached was that, and this was their words, unemployment insurance and welfare programs have made unemployment insufficiently terrifying. So the assault on the basic provisions for unemployed and poor people, and even disabled people, has been very, very central to an attack on the whole working class population. That's an important thing, I think, to understand. We don't approach organising the poor as a kind of an act of charity or kindness. It's part of a broader working class strategy to fight back. And I think that's really, really important to understand. And the severity of the drive to undermine income support programs for unemployed and poor people has been something that has dominated our work over the last 25 years, because it's been a worsening, a mounting agenda. So as we were formed, the first conference of our organisation was really a kind of a debate between two different ideas of how the poor could and should be organised. There was a wing of people who turned out to be a minority there, who argued that what we should do is we should build a kind of a polite lobbying organisation of concerned citizens who wanted to educate governments and the public about poverty. And then there was a wing that I confess I was very much part of, that argued that no, we certainly want to educate people. We're not suggesting otherwise, but primarily we want to build up resistance in poor communities. We want to build an actual force of people that can fight back, and that's been the perspective that we put into place. Workers who are employed have the strike weapon. That is the way in which people fight back. People who are homeless, people who are living on social assistance payments, don't have the ability to withdraw labour to go on strike. But what they do have is the power to engage in disruptive forms of collective action. And that's the substitute for the strike weapon that poor communities have at their disposal, and that we've tried to build up a capacity to unleash. There's two American writers, Francis Fox Piven and Richard A. Cloward, who in one of their books said that the main way in which the poor can have influence is through their ability to create crises by disrupting institutions. And that's the kind of method that we've tried to put into effect. And it's not made us popular with people in high places, but that's absolutely fine. So we've employed that kind of disruptive collective action model as a method of working class resistance at really different levels. Every day, welfare bureaucracies and what have you deny basic support to poor people, very often in violation of their own rules. So people are denied income and people face homelessness. And we've used methods of collective action to represent people in individual situations. One of the first actions that I remember we engaged in, an immigrant worker came to see us who had worked for a Shell gas station, pumping gas for several days. At the end of that time, he was told, well, we don't need you anymore, goodbye. So he said, well, then I've worked here for 5 days, I'd like my wages. And they said to him, well, actually, during this 5 days, we were training you, so we're not going to pay you anything. So what we did was we got together a whole bunch of our members and we went and we picketed the gas station and we shut down the place and prevented any cars from getting in. And all of a sudden, the training thing was taken off the table and the man got his wages. We had 2 cleaners come to see us. I remember they were both from Central America, really fairly recent immigrant people. They came to see us because they had been cleaners working in a restaurant that was at Bay Street, where business people would go and have their lunch and such like. And they would work there at night cleaning this place up. And they were owed they were owed a month's wages, and then they were let go without being paid their wages. So we took about 50 of our members into the restaurant and took over the tables and said, "You're not going to serve anybody until these people get their money." And the owner of the restaurant came out and said, "Well, look, I'm not legally responsible for paying these people because they were working for a contractor." And we said, "Legally that's true, but we don't really care. The fact is that if you are going to use some unethical contractor to exploit these people to get your place cleaned, then as far as we're concerned, you're responsible. So we will picket your restaurant every day until these people get their money," and they got their money that night. So those kinds of things have proven to be a very, very effective form of action. We've carried out hundreds and hundreds of such actions to get people their welfare money, to get people wages that they weren't paid. On one occasion, some people were facing deportation to Kenya from Canada, and we went and organised a demonstration at the airport in front of the Air Canada checkout, and it led to the cancellation of the deportations. So these kinds of things have been very, very, very central to the work that we've done. And we've used it we've used the same kind of methods around broader actions and campaigns, not about individual people's situations, but about broader issues. One example that sort of strikes me as a good one to illustrate the kind of methods that we've used is when people are homeless and they are poor and they are destitute, sometimes they ask for money on the streets. That was mentioned at the beginning. So one year back, some number of years ago, the chief of police gave an interview to the Toronto Star, and he said that the biggest priority that his police force would have over the next year would be a crackdown on people panhandling, on people asking for money on the streets. Now, you may say that for that to be the major priority for the police force in the largest city in the country would seem to be a little strange. So this clearly was an attack that was motivated by the big merchants. He made clear that Cadillac Fairview, the people that run the Eaton Centre, were complaining to him all the time about people asking for money. So we said to ourselves, what is it that they would like even less than small groups of people out on the street outside their shops asking for money? The obvious thing was hundreds of people inside their shops asking for money. So we organised what we called a mass panhandle, and with cups banging and whatnot, we marched right through the middle of the Eaton Centre, and it led to a distinct improvement in the situation. Over all the years that we've been organising, we've tried to use those kinds of methods to challenge what is going on and to challenge some of the big government attacks. Going back to the very early days of our organisation, we dealt with the NDP in power in Ontario. The only time that the NDP has taken power in Ontario, and as I think many members of the NDP would agree, the government behaved quite disgracefully during the period that it was in power. One of the ways in which this happened, one of the ways in which their regressive, backsliding agenda manifested itself, was the degree to which they intensified the attack on poor people. They had campaigned on the platform that they were going to end the need for food banks. I remember the leader of the NDP at the time, Bob Rae, when we marched to Queen's Park while the Liberals were still in power to call for a 25% increase in social assistance rates. Rae met us and he said that he would agree to support our demand only reluctantly because we weren't asking for enough. And in power, he froze welfare rates. And even more, he added to the kind of demonisation of poor people. And one of the measures that they took was that they hired hundreds of welfare investigators to look for so-called welfare cheats, people on social assistance pocketing small amounts of money to augment their poverty income to try to survive. And not only did they do that, but they did it with flourish. The Minister of Community and Social Services, a man by the name of Tony Salipo, announced that he was going to organise a province-wide tour to promote his crackdown on welfare cheats. And not banking cheats, not corporate cheats, not Bay Street cheats, but welfare cheats, poor people. So the first meeting that he held was in Toronto, and we mobilised for it very, very seriously. We held a big dinner out on the sidewalk outside the place, and then we brought everybody in, and we made up the majority of the audience. So as soon as the minister got up to speak, we went up onto the stage and we announced, we took the microphone away from him and we announced that we were going to be reorganising the meeting on the basis of how to fight back against the crackdown on the poor. And the minister got in his limousine and left, and we took over the meeting. And the tour that he had announced was cancelled. So that was an example of fighting back. Now the NDP, when it went down to defeat, was replaced, of course, by the most reactionary Margaret Thatcher-like government that has existed in probably ever in Canada, the Harris Conservative government of the 1990s. And they organised a brutal attack on the poor. They cut social assistance rates, which were already terribly low. They cut them by 21.6% and then froze them against inflation, so that people got poorer and poorer and poorer. And we tried to organise to resist that. One of the first things that we did was we organised a march from Regent Park, a very poor community in the downtown east of Toronto, to the home of the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, who was going to be signing the welfare cut into effect in the name of the Queen. And his home was a mansion in Rosedale, a very wealthy neighbourhood. So we marched hundreds and hundreds of poor people into Rosedale to demand that the cut not took place. We weren't able to stop it, but we organised an ongoing resistance throughout the life of the Harris government that involved many powerful demonstrations. And when the Conservatives came to an end, they were replaced by the Liberal Party in Ontario in 2003. The Liberals had campaigned on the basis of saying that they were going to be very different, that they were going to reverse the brutal measures of cutbacks and austerity that the Conservatives have implemented. And in practice, of course, they did no such thing. They gave tiny increases to social assistance that were below inflation, making people even poorer, in total contradistinction to everything that they talked about doing. So we looked for ways to fight back. We looked for ways to actually demand an increase in social assistance rates, which had now fallen dramatically, so that the people were going to food banks, people were being evicted from their homes and being put on the streets in record numbers. And we came up with an idea that struck us as having enormous possibilities. We came across an obscure benefit that existed under the rules, the social assistance, the special diet. The special diet was something that if you got a doctor or another medical provider to fill in a form, that you would be entitled to more money for food on the grounds that it was medically necessary. At that time, almost nobody knew about it, and if people did apply, welfare offices would simply tell them, no, sorry, and people would be turned down. So we said to ourselves, how about if we organised a whole huge campaign to access the special diet, to make people aware of it? And we found sympathetic medical providers who would organise with us clinics that we called hunger clinics. And we started signing people up in very big numbers for the special diet. And it led to a situation where people in other cities started to do the same thing, and where people who were poor just themselves went to their doctors, went to walk-in clinics, did all kinds of things to get the special diet. We created an awareness of it. And it led to a situation where the Auditor General of Ontario announced that the payments for the special diet had gone from $6 million a year to $200 million a year. So we were actually getting money back to people in a really important, in a really important way. But of course, what happened as we started to confront the welfare bureaucracy and started to get money to people is they started to put up barriers. They started to deny people. They started to come up with all kinds of reasons to try to block people. So what it meant was that as we went into communities and we started to organise these clinics, people would come and get signed up, but then they would have to fight for their benefits. So we started to organise massive case actions where we would bring large numbers of people out to demand the benefits that they had been given according to the rules of the system actually be provided. And it led to this incredible ongoing campaign. Over time, the government cut the adequacy of the program down, and the clinics that we were organising became impossible. But through a Freedom of Information request, we discovered that in fact spending on the special diet has continued to increase. That we've been able through that campaign to actually put back millions of dollars into the pockets of people who would otherwise not have them. And what that means for people is, there was a particular story that I told many times because I'll always remember it. What it means for what the campaign meant for people. I was sitting in the OCAP office one day and the phone rang and I happened to be the one to pick it up. And there was a woman, by her accent I could tell she was a Somali woman, as were many of the people that participated in the campaign for the special diet. A Somali woman who is describing to me the situation that she's in. She has come to one of our special diet clinics. She's been denied the benefit, so she's participated in a large action with dozens and dozens of other people and got the benefit that she's entitled to. She gets the first special diet payment of $250 for every member of her family. And she goes shopping to a grocery store. And now suddenly she has enough income to actually provide decent nutrition to her children. So she buys fresh strawberries, and it is the first time that her children have ever tasted fresh strawberries. And she sits there on the phone crying her eyes out, explaining how fantastic it is to be watching her children eating these strawberries. And I mean, it was magnificent for that family, but there was something more than just that family. There was something about human dignity, there was something about resistance in that story that I've never, ever forgotten. So the fight around social assistance and decent income continues. We've continued to fight back against them. In 2012, the Liberal government announced that they were going to eliminate a vital benefit called the Community Startup and Maintenance Benefit. Now, what this benefit provides is it provided payments to people who were trying to keep their housing at risk of becoming homeless, or people who were homeless who were trying to establish a home. So it provided a payment of $799 to a single person, $1,500 to a family, so that if people had had bed bug infestation or a fire or flood, or if they had to come up with last month's rent in order to move into a place, they could use that money to get themselves established. And the government announced that what they were going to do is they were going to cut the funding in half, but that also they were going to abolish the provincial program and just download the program onto the municipal levels of government, so that each city would decide how it was going to run things, which is obviously an incredibly downward step in terms of the adequacy of the program. So we organised with allies in what had become known as the Raise the Rates Coalition. We had marches on the streets, indigenous people up in the North Shore of Lake Huron mobilised with us and actually blocked the Trans-Canada Highway as part of the week of action. And it led to a situation where the government put $54 million back into the program for that year, but we weren't able to stop them downloading it onto the municipalities. So then we deal with a situation where the City of Toronto now operates something called the Housing Stabilisation Fund, that is the replacement for the community startup at the Toronto level. And what they started to do was to deliberately hold it back from people and then announce that, well, there's no demand for it. People obviously don't need it, so we can cut it even further. And so there was a kind of a dirty war going on where they were just systematically denying people. And we tried to find a way to resist it. And then one day, a woman called us up, called Laura Bardot, who had applied for the Housing Stabilisation Fund. This was a disabled mother with 2 disabled children. And they had told her that she had income in excess and didn't qualify. So we said to ourselves, how can it possibly be that a woman living in poverty with 2 disabled children has too much income to get money to replace all the furniture that she'd lost to a bed bug infestation? How can that be? So we confronted them. We organised a lot of actions. We organised a mass delegation to City Hall, and it led to a situation where Laura got her money, but they also released their secret policies. And what we discovered was that if you were on social assistance and you applied, that was one level of poverty. But in order to qualify, you had to be poorer than that. So that if you were getting any special diet money, that was deducted. They even deducted the money that people got for a guide dog if they were blind. And so we challenged that and was able to get that reversed. So that fight is ongoing. At the provincial level, the government has now announced that they're going to organise a pilot project for a new system that they're called basic income. And it's at one level an extremely cynical move, because what they're looking to do is to test out a new system for the next 3 years, give it to only 4,000 people, and use that as an excuse to not increase the social assistance rates for everybody else. So we're arguing that everyone must get an increase right now, and we're taking up that fight. The final thing I would just speak about before we have questions and discussion is I'd like to talk a little bit about the situation of homeless people in Toronto and some of the issues that apply there and some of the ways in which we've tried to fight back. Because if there is an agenda of austerity, people who are homeless are, in a certain sense, the most extreme victims of that agenda. People who've actually lost housing, people who are actually reduced to sleeping on the streets. So, over the years, we've taken up many challenges on the homeless front. But in recent years, the conditions in the shelters have got worse than ever. People are being crowded into facilities in a way that's completely inhuman. 2 winters ago, one of our members went down to what is called a warming centre, a place that's not really a shelter, but it's a place that people are able to go in supposedly just to get warm, but in practice people sleep there all night. And what he discovered was a facility in which the rules of the shelter system say that sleeping spaces are supposed to be 2.5 feet apart from each other, which is not very generous. And what he discovered is people crammed into this place in such numbers that they were sleeping 2 to a mat, and they had run out of floor space. so that people were sleeping on tables, on chairs, and propped up against walls. And with 2 toilets for all those people, but in fact only one that was working. Just an absolutely dreadful, dreadful situation. So we've organised a whole series of actions to demand that more space be opened up. On one occasion we went to the Mayor's office and we announced that we were setting up a homeless shelter in front of the Mayor's office, and we put down sleeping bags and the cops came and arrested a bunch of us and what have you, but it led to more space being opened up. John Tory, the new mayor that's been in for a while now, we organised a couple of weeks ago a camp out in front of his luxury condominium and slept on the streets in front of John Tory's home. The need to open up more space now is absolutely so pressing that it just can't be described. The number of people who are dying, the number of people whose lives are being destroyed is absolutely incredible. And it's really, I think, speaks more than anything to the need for fight back and resistance. So that's kind of an overview of some of the work that we've done, a very quick overview. I think it needs to be said, though, that if we are talking about an agenda of neoliberal austerity, it needs to be understood that it's a work in progress. The last British Prime Minister, by the name of David Cameron, gave a speech a few years ago at the Lord Mayor's banquet in London, in which he pointed out that austerity wasn't really about a temporary set of arrangements, but about a permanent reorganisation of society. And I think that speech was delivered right there at the Lord Mayor's banquet, rather appropriately, was somehow a very telling thing. They are intensifying austerity. It's no longer about reducing what people are entitled to, it's about abandoning people. Homeless people are being abandoned to die on the streets. Public housing is being boarded up for lack of repairs. It's a brutal agenda, and it's in the interests of all working class people and all communities to fight back against that situation. And I hope that through the work that we've done, we've created a model that's useful in terms of resisting and fighting back against poverty, social abandonment and austerity. Thank you very much.
So we're going to take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back for questions and answers. Thank you. It's time for our question and answer period. So if anybody has any questions, maybe we'll do 2 questions at a time. If they're related, then it'll be easier for Mr. Clarke to answer. So does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Start right away?
Yeah, stand up. Tell us your question.
First of all, I would like to say it was really a remarkable presentation. It was effective and promising. So thank you very much for this insightful presentation. My question is about the response of security and police forces to your activity when you guys conducting these activities, going to a restaurant, going to gas station, and so forth. How did the security forces and police respond? And do you guys have to ask for permission prior to activities? Because as we know in this kind of system, in capitalism, the security forces are more are there to protect, the benefit or the interest of the ruling class or the rich class. So my question is, how did they interact with your activities?
An answer along with this question? No one? Okay.
I think it's good to start with the state. I mean, obviously, in Canada, we're dealing with a system where there are some level of civil liberties and rights that, in many contexts, people are organising against much more overtly brutal and repressive regimes. But fundamentally, this is a capitalist society and this is a capitalist state. And certainly, I mean, you posed the question, do we ask for permission? And that's a good place to start, because we most assuredly do not ask for permission. In fact, it's a matter of policy that we will never apply for a permit to hold a demonstration or a march. And if the police come to us at the beginning and say, what's the route of the march, we say, you'll find out. And if they say to us, what can we do to help this march, we say, go away. So we don't have any level of cooperation with them in that sense. We do obviously have to deal with the police, but we faced, I mean, relative to the struggles and repression that people have faced in many places, we've faced very little. But we've nonetheless faced a significant amount of police attack, arrest. We've had people injured. During the year 2000, we organised a demonstration to Queen's Park where they used horses and riot police to try to drive us off of the grounds of the legislature. And then when we had dozens of injured people, they wouldn't allow ambulances to come and assist people. And we faced lots of different criminal charges. Some of us have faced some periods of imprisonment and time in jail and this kind of stuff. So yeah, we've faced a level of that. But I mean, in a certain sense, if you're going to use tactics that are disruptive and challenging, then you're going to be dealing with the state and you're going to be dealing with the police, and that's fairly inevitable. We've relied a lot on progressive lawyers who've been of enormous assistance to us in getting people out of jail and beating charges and these kinds of things. But I would anticipate that in the period ahead, the repression will be greater because austerity will intensify and resistance will grow. And in the final analysis, living in a liberal democracy with a parliament, and it provides some level of protection, but it doesn't provide a fundamental difference. This is still capitalism, it's still a capitalist state.
As you know, poverty always was there, and still I think it will be there always, as long as there is an increase in attacking from the elites or their governments on poverty people. So my question is, if would be, but let's say, how do I organize, how do I frame my question? I mean, there's a marijuana. So as you know, in the BC, I think there's a marijuana party. And why wouldn't we have a party for the party poverty? And it would be much better. I mean, do you think it wouldn't be much better for you to have a party, political party, even, let's say, on the level of the provincial, even of the, let's say, even in the city of Toronto, GTA? Because your job is almost, as you mentioned, that day by day is attacking, and your, how do I say, your movement is almost kind of, it's on the corner by the legal issue, by the legal, I mean, the powers, police and government is, and as you mentioned, day by day you are being limited, your movement to go to limit. I mean, still I'm asking, I heard that at the past they asked you this question, many people. Now when I'm listening to your presentation, I think this is a question that will be raised among you, I don't know, or other peoples, because I mean, within a political party, you may gain something, or without a political party. I know the movements, workers, or the political movements, or social movement, or even poverty movements, maybe. I don't want to kill those movements as independent movements. But let's say for the poverty issue, wouldn't it be better to have a political party?
First of all, thank you for your sharing your experience. But there is something. I'm a cab driver, taxi driver in a different city in Gulf. Daily I'm seeing something, it's what surprised me, and I don't know people, even the government or any organization, they don't care about those people. I'm gonna tell you about 3 things when I saw by my eyes, and so far one of them, they get effect and lost his leg. That guy, he was a professor, he was a teacher in university. He got some mental issue, I think. This guy, he got some skin problem, disease. Okay, this guy, he's walking from his house to downtown of Guelph, and from there to food bank, from there to, there is a place to drop-in center to eat, and going all around in the winter time in every day, usually every day. Day by day, I saw this guy about 15 years ago. Until now, every time when I saw this guy, the skin effect, it was worse day by day. So suddenly, this guy get leg infection, and one, they send him to hospital. I don't know who sent him to hospital, and he lost one of them. So my question for this one, from 15 years ago until now, nobody take this guy to hospital or to anywhere to get any treatment or any medication or anything for his skin or his disease until this guy, he's still walking and going, and nobody care about that. There is one. Another guy in this winter time, which was snowing 5 kilometers from his house, walking without the shoes to downtown, and from downtown to his house. What's the reason? I don't know. I don't care what's the reason. But why nobody, police or government or any organization, take this guy and tell him, buddy, or control him, buddy, you're gonna lose your leg if you don't have a shoes and walking every time without the shoes, especially in the winter time in that cold. So who is responsible about those people? Why nobody do something about those? This is my question. Thank you.
I think that there is a vital need to build movements, and that's the focus that our organisation takes up. I don't think the issue. Personally, I don't believe that we would have been better if we had tried to form a poor people's party. There is a real need for political leadership in the working class, but I don't think that we could that we would be more effective to have a kind of a lobbying, trying to get the attention of people through the political process approach in terms of trying to deal with the immediate issues of poverty. One of the things that has happened that's been remarkable over the years has been the party that has a base in the working class in this country is the NDP. And the degree to which the NDP politicians have pulled back from, most of them, have pulled back from a commitment to speak out on poverty issues and defend the poor has been very sad. And that's been a big loss. I can remember in the early days of OCAP, the ability to know that we would have support for what we were doing in the Queen's Park Legislative Caucus of the NDP counted for a lot. And over the years that's been lost to a huge degree. In Britain at the moment, we have close working relationship with a lot of the anti-poverty organisations in the UK, and the Jeremy Corbyn leadership that has emerged in the Labour Party has made an enormous difference in terms of readiness to speak out and support the struggles and what have you of the poor. So there is a real role for political parties and political leadership, but I also feel there's an important need to build movements on the streets as well. In terms of the other question, we deal more and more with an agenda of outright abandonment, where people with particular needs are not being helped, and sort of medical support for people is scandalously bad. Homeless people's access to hospitals and care is compromised massively. At St Michael's Hospital, for example, in downtown Toronto, the security regime they have there and how they treat homeless people is absolutely scandalous. And as healthcare gets eroded, it's the poorest people and the most and the most destitute people who are shut out the most. A few years ago, we had an OCAP action at which a man showed up who was homeless. He's a young man, and what had happened is that he'd been sleeping and he'd put his shoes down beside him, and a group of young men, thinking it'd be very funny, came and stole his shoes, and he chased them, and he stepped on some broken glass and cut his foot very, very badly, very severely, and went to he hobbled in bleeding very, very badly into our event. So we took him to the emergency, and they took him in, and we thought everything would be fine. We thought we wouldn't see him again. A couple of hours later, he shows up at our action, hobbling, and we said, how could they possibly just let you go? And he said, well, they told me I had to go home and put my feet up. But he's never home, right? So, I mean, that kind of neglect of people, that kind of abandonment of people you're absolutely right. You're seeing it in Guelph. You see it everywhere. People are not being helped. People are not being provided for.
To add on to that answer, I think sometimes when we feel like the government is, or we're hopeless in front of the government, I think that's when we have to step in and take action, and like you did with your group, sometimes it's the little people that need to do the big work. Yes, Barry, and anybody else have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, Takao after, and Judy after, yeah.
My name is Barry. I spoke to many of you on behalf of Socialist Action about a month or so ago. How many of you were here at the time? Quite a few. Okay, so great to be here again. And I want to say at the outset that this is not so much a question as a comment, because I agree with everything that John said. And we've been working together directly and indirectly for many years. In fact, my party, Socialist Action, is a big supporter of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty for the reasons explained by John. They don't ask for permission, they take direct action. And that empowers those who are engaged in the action to challenge the establishment and to fight to change the society fundamentally from the grassroots up. There are a couple of very interesting things that have happened very recently, and that create illusions in the minds of some of our co-workers and friends, but really need to be seen in the clear light of day as to what they really represent. I'm referring to two reforms that the Ontario government is contemplating. One is labor law reform. You've heard about it. $14 an hour minimum wage to take effect in about half a year from now, and $15 minimum wage per hour, $15 at the beginning of 2019. Improvements in access to the right to unionize for certain groups of workers who have been considered independent contractors and outside the realm of collective bargaining and unionization. Small improvements in terms of access to vacation and sick leave with some pay for part of the time. These are important possible victories that have not yet been achieved, but they're being offered by the government. They're being promoted by the government. And there's another one as well, and it's called basic income. John didn't get into it, and he has a very good critique of this. I won't go into it any more than to say, when the government of Ontario proposes implementing a study, maybe over a 2 or 3 year period, in which they take a group of people and say, well, we'll give you access to a guaranteed minimum income. I think it's something like $17,000 a year, $21,000, $22,000 if you have dependents in the household. Of course, that's inadequate. And there are dangers with respect to the basic income proposal that these ruling elites are contemplating. But why are they proposing labor law reform? Why are they proposing a minimum income? I think it's because there are other responses to the current situation of instability. It's because the ruling class is divided. And they know that there's a growing contradiction between the enormous wealth that a tiny proportion of the population enjoy and the rest of us, and in particular those who are at the very bottom of social dispensation. There's a crisis of bourgeois ideology, because in this society we're taught, and some of the teachers actually believe, that there is an opportunity to advance, to enjoy the amenities of that this society offers, and that we shouldn't tolerate injustice, bigotry, and growing social inequality. And yet there is growing social inequality. And this crisis of bourgeois ideology, that the society is not living up to its claims, not living up to expectations, augments another crisis, a crisis of the economy, a crisis in which there's growing structural unemployment. Fewer and fewer people can look forward, as young people, to having a stable a job for a long period of time that actually enables them to earn a decent living. Work is increasingly precarious and increasingly without benefits or without any opportunity to have a stable, enjoyable life. So this bourgeois ideological crisis on top of the economic crisis, which is the cause of the austerity agenda, is the reason why governments show division on this question. Some trying to offer reforms that hold out the promise of better times. It's fake. These are empty promises, but nonetheless they offer them because they know there's a growing dissatisfaction with what is happening in Canadian society. The solution to the real crises at the root of these problems, in our view, is socialist transformation of society. There's no reason why the enormous wealth that this society, that the working class generates, cannot be put to use in the interests of the vast majority. There's absolutely no reason why there should be such enormous poverty in this society. The solution to the crisis cannot be found within the system, because this system is all about maximizing private profit and squeezing workers to the greatest extent possible to generate those profits for a tiny minority, even if they produce things that people don't have money to buy. That is part of the inherent internal contradiction of the system. And if the solution is not within capitalist society, then the solution must involve a break with existing class society. And a socialist revolution, which is the necessary process by which we create a new society, involves two requirements. One, a working class that is rising in anger and growing awareness of the unacceptability of present conditions and the need for radical change. And secondly, a revolutionary leadership in the unions and all working class organizations that fights for a program to change society fundamentally. Not as an act of charity, but as an act of justice and revolt against unacceptable conditions. Unacceptable for people, unacceptable for the environment, increasingly, which is threatened by capitalism and its wasteful and warlike practices. Final point I want to make. I hope you'll give me another minute to do so. The working class in Canada, and you know this better than anybody, is a multinational, multiracial working class. Most Canadians come from somewhere else. Of course, the indigenous people who were here before us for tens of thousands of years. But the vast majority of Canadians come from somewhere else. And we are either first or second or third generation. I'm second generation. My parents and grandparents came from Europe. They came in the turmoil of World War. Okay, First World War on my mother's side, Second World War in the case of my father's side. All of you know about war. All of you know about oppression. All of you know about the suffering. And you come to this country, you bring with you militant, working class traditions, militant memories of self-organization. You know how it's done elsewhere. But we are separated. We are separated from one another by language, by ethnicity, even sometimes by religion. We need to unite. And the first step is to get involved in social struggles in this country. The ties that bind you to country of origin, whether it's Iraq or Syria or Turkey or wherever, those are powerful and should never be forgotten. And you should keep your language and develop your culture. But we need to get involved in the social struggles and the class struggle in this country. And on what issues? The issues include wages, include health and safety at work, include women's rights, which are increasingly under attack, on the protection of the environment, which is increasingly threatened by the practices of capital accumulation. by union democracy, because if our unions were more democratic, they would be fighting the problems that the brother here talked about, and that John has talked about, and that have been ignored or suppressed for so long. The unions are led by people who are comfortable with the status quo, but we're not comfortable with the status quo. We have a burning desire to change the status quo, and we need to have more democratic, rank-and-file, community-based, workplace-based organizations willing to fight, and that's going to take leadership. And if you want to be involved in the process of making our organizations more democratic, and you want to be involved in the process of getting involved in the issues of the class struggle in this country, if you are a socialist, the best thing you can do is to join with other socialists who are doing just that, who are fighting for class struggle policies in the unions, even in the labor-based NDP, without any illusions about the nature of that leadership of the NDP and its policies. They're totally pro-capitalist policies and totally not in the interest of the working class. But you have hundreds of thousands, millions of workers voting for this party, and we need to challenge the practices and policies there, and to create a class struggle left wing that will go on to build a mass revolutionary party in this country that will lead the working class to power when the working class is ready to rise and to challenge the establishment and to take power into its own hands. So I warmly invite you to get involved in the issues of the class struggle in this country and to join with us in Socialist Action and other organizations who are engaged in those struggles. You'll find strong partners in the fight for a better world. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Definitely deserves a round of applause. Thank you for that message. So we have 3 questions. Kakawa, Judy, and Saibul Khan.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I don't know, I was hoping to hear more about the mosaic structure of poverty in Canada. You kind of somehow overgeneralize it. Poverty in Canada, it exists, yes. It goes up and down, yes, in the last 3-4 decades. So I have 2 questions. You mentioned that the NDP, during the NDP leadership in this province, one of the major attack was going after welfare people, about cheating with the welfare system in Ontario. I wonder, according to my understanding, while you're speaking, and your colleagues are the most close people to the NDP, why during that time this raid, like this kind of things happen, this kind of brutality against the welfare people? That's one question. Like that's while you were talking, I was searching, I couldn't find that, but I know that poverty went down from 1989 to 1990. Other than that period of time, Ontario has been struggling with getting rid of two-digit numbers of poverty in the province. So that's one of the questions. And another question is, partially I mentioned, I said, why didn't you go into more details to show us the mosaic structure of this bad phenomena in Canadian society, while when you step out of Canada, you go to other countries. Canada is looked at as a very social, democratic country with very high standard of living, with like those kind of perspectives that we receive from others. Don't you think? I joined anti-poverty in 2000 in Vancouver, by the way. I was one of those activists in Wood War building when they were destroyed. I was with Ivan, with Aaron. I'm very familiar with those guys.
Bravo.
But that's the question for me. We can't just stick to the same method that consuming our energies, keeping us on the same spot. We are just moving in the same circle and saying the same stories. It's the time for progressive people. I'm not going to say, I'm not pro any title. Progressive, pro-people, pro-community people should ask themselves why the NDP during the Jack Layton wins 119 seats or 110 seats, something like that. Why, when this leadership goes away, you end up with somebody like Tom Mulcair's and this disaster that we experienced in the past? Don't you think it's the time for us to get rid of that overgeneralization ideas, that labeling, that titling, that everything is bad in this country. I don't want to mention wars. Don't you think we gotta be more rationalized about this and more open to new ideas and talk to the public instead of just bring or like fixed ideas and drop it right there, everything's bad? Because I think investing in the government is not a bad idea. This province is costing, like poverty cost this province somewhere between 10 to 15 billion dollars annually. This is a disaster for the government itself. Even Kathleen herself is on CBC screaming, crying. John Tory is like, with shelter issue is a disaster. Like the most unpopular premier in the history of Ontario is Kathleen Wynne, and we know that it's based on the last survey they did it in CBC. So my question again, are we gonna say the same thing that I heard in 2000? Or isn't the time for us, for me as me and you as two old colleagues? I have sat down in your presentation, by the way. Just remember your British accent in Vancouver. We're discussing these issues, and I'm struggling, forgive me to say this, I'm struggling to accept your ideas for tackling this issue again with the same method. We gotta come up with different stories. We gotta think about indigenous women. Like the highest rate of poverty is among the indigenous women. The 30%, they create 37% of the poverty rate in Canada. The second group comes indigenous children. And it has to do with those isolated community in the north of Ontario. And don't forget that this province is growing every single year. Like you receive about 8,000 immigrants that stay in Toronto. They don't go somewhere else. Which is the second group they suffer with poverty are the immigrant, the minority groups. So I think it's time for us to revise our alternatives, our perspectives, our ideas for dealing with this issue. Thank you so much. Sorry, I talked.
Do you want to tackle that?
But with regards to the situation in Ontario, I mean, what I tried to set out was something that I believe is correct, which is that you have seen an intensification of poverty as part of a general plan, a general strategy to increase the level of exploitation.
Can I ask one thing?
Yeah.
Do you think some people out there, they want to see people are impoverished, living poverty? This is a question. Do they do this in purpose, or they do something else that causes poverty here?
No, I think in that sense it's nothing personal. What they want is profits. What capitalism wants is profits. If it was profitable to make people to treat people well, then we'd all be doing very, very well. But it's not profitable to treat people well. When I talked about the special diet campaign that we took up, for example, and I think that perhaps brings home the point that I was trying to make, was if you were successful in getting the special diet, you could achieve an extra $250 for yourself and for every member of your family. And that was providing people with a level of income that was enabling them to live not well, not even to escape poverty, but to live much better. And the government, the Liberal government, responded ferociously to try to stop that from happening. Because, for a very, very simple reason, during the years that the Liberals have been in power, in the early days that they took power, one worker in 40 in this province was working for the minimum wage. That's now gone to one worker in 8, right? In other words, the growth of low-wage, precarious work has been enormous during the period in which the Liberals have been in power. Now, if you imagine somebody living on $600 a month, a single person, and they suddenly get an extra $250, that makes a huge difference in terms of whether they're prepared to sit by the phone and hope that their gouging employer is going to call them in for a few hours. It makes a difference about whether they're going to accept a job in which they have to work with dangerous chemicals and face all kinds of abuses. It gives actually people a bit more power in their hands, just a little bit more bargaining power. And that was going against the whole agenda that's being implemented. So I am suggesting, yes, that there has been a deliberate attempt to use impoverishment as a way of increasing the scramble for the lowest paying jobs on offer. That's been central to the whole strategy that's been implemented. And I think we need to understand that's what we're up against. And in terms of new ways, I mean, in a certain sense, we're always amenable to new ways and new tactics. It's not that we're wedded to some, proceeding by rote, but we do believe that there is a class war that is unfolding, and the other side is launching it. And class wars are always really unfortunate when they're one-sided, and so we need to fight back. We need to fight back, and that's what we're trying to do. I'm sure we've made mistakes. I'm sure there's better ways we could do things, but fundamentally, I don't think there's some collaborative effort that's going to bring us all together and the lion is going to lie down with the lamb. I just don't think that's the way society is going to change.
Thank you. Judy, did you have a question? You pass? Okay.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for your issue, and I'm really interested in. But as the comrades Cow mentioned that for in here, like how to know the situation for the people in here, poor people, and your organization and other like labor organization, they are fighting for change or increase the minimum wage for the laborers. But beside that, the war around the like Middle East and especially in Syria, and the government accept. I really support to help the people, the refugee people, but when they accept like more than 10,000 people, they came here and they have to cost money for the shelter, for education, for that, and there's like something difference between your people in your country and you bring other refugee in this country, and there's a problem in here to solve this problem, but who's created this problem? And my question is why the best solution in here is the socialism, like people has to involve with the socialism, but why in the election time people more they go to the vote for the liberalism or other parties? This is my question.
Any other questions before? Yes, Mitchell?
I have, my name is Mitchell Shore. I'm part of Socialist Action as well. I have two questions for you, John. Every day I walk to work. I work at Bay and Wellesley, and I get off the subway at Bay Station, and I walk down Bay Street, and I see at least 4 homeless people on the streets every day, largely because they don't want to sleep in the shelters, I would assume. They're out there. I'm curious to know, what are some practical things that people can do when they see homeless people? It's just an issue that I think people would like to hear an answer to. Also, can you talk a little bit about the Open the Armories campaign? And considering it was something that we were dealing with during the terribly cold winter that we had, but even now, with the extreme amounts of rain, it must be terrible for people to be stuck outside in these conditions, and I'm curious to know what the mayor's excuse for not opening the armories was or is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then our last question back to Clarke Idris. Do you want to ask it? And
No,
then
after that.
After? Okay, sure.
Okay. There's a great deal of dishonesty and hypocrisy being spoken by the government, the Trudeau government, around the issue of refugees. Trudeau has very famously sent out a tweet in which he was welcome to Canada, and he suggested that Canada is a home for all the world's dispossessed and suffering people. At the same time as he maintains a safe third country agreement with the United States that forces people to cross frozen wilderness to try to put in an application as refugees. And we believe that it's absolutely necessary for the working class movement as a whole to take an internationalist position and support refugees. And it's particularly vile and disingenuous for the Canadian state to suggest that it's doing more than its fair share to deal with the world refugee crisis, which it has contributed to such an enormous extent. On a world scale, Canada is an exploiting country, and its mining companies gouge and exploit the world everywhere. Canada is part of the looting of Africa. Canada is part of world exploitation, and its modest efforts to provide home for some refugees is very, very small. And we fight for maximum. We fight at the moment. The homeless shelters are seeing an influx of refugees, and that's being used to try to whip up racism and hatred. And we're doing everything we can to fight back against that, and say that the problem is not refugees, the problem is capitalism, and the problem is the bankers and the corporations. And quite honestly, the other day I actually saw a homeless man shouting abuse at someone that he considered to be a refugee, a woman of colour, and he was screaming at her. And I went up to him and I said, "Let me ask you this: who would you rather put in a boat in the Atlantic? This woman and other refugees, or the cops?" And he said, "Well, you've got a point." So, I mean, the refugees are not the enemy of working people in this country. We need to take an internationalist position, and I totally agree with you that the answer is not to be found in anything other than building a socialist society. That's the goal that we must have, and if we're not able to achieve that today, we must fight for the very best of our ability to create the maximum unity of working class people that includes refugees. Refugees should be welcome, and the capitalists are not welcome as far as we're concerned. On the question of what people can do around homeless people, people do show acts of kindness and decency and solidarity all the time, and that's great. But the solutions are to fight for. Immediately, unfortunately, we fight for shelter beds, but we need to fight for housing for everyone. We must have a movement that is capable of winning those things. And the question of the armories brings that home. During the years when Mike Harris was in power, when he cut social assistance rates by 21.6%, there was a 60% increase in the number of people using homeless shelters. And several homeless people died that first winter in the 90s. Under terrible circumstances. An Iranian refugee homeless man was found. This got a lot of media coverage. It was shocking. This man was found after a snowstorm, frozen to death on the streets down by the lake, and they couldn't identify his body because his hands were frozen to his face. And that was so shocking that it led to the opening of the federal armories as a place where people could take shelter. And now, in this period of crisis, people are saying it should happen again. And John Tory is resisting it. And his only excuse is that we've looked at the arm.
Why you don't have a political party? You just gave responsibility to NDP. I'm sorry, man, to NDP. I mean, do you believe that NDP is represent class worker and worker class? I mean, as you know, they abandoned the socialism and their ideologies are gone.
Right. No, I'm not. I certainly wasn't advocating for the NDP as the force that's going to change society. I do believe that there are, in social democratic parties, there are important struggles that take place. And I do believe in building, yes, there must be a political leadership built in the working class. Political parties must be built. That's absolutely true. I don't think that we can organise a poor people's political party. I think there has to be broader working class political activity. But I was simply arguing that I felt that the focus that OCAP has on actually building movements of resistance and a social mobilisation was a very, very important part of what needs to be done. I wasn't trying to in any way be dismissive of the notion of building revolutionary political leadership. On the contrary, that needs to be built.
I think Barry has a comment on that.
Yeah. If you don't mind, because I've
No,
spoken
that's
already, is it okay?
Yeah,
Take
that's
a couple of
okay.
minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, folks. I proceed on the premise now that the problem is the system, not the working class. The problem is the system. And I say, with respect to anyone who may have a contrary view, I don't think that no matter how persuasive we might be, no matter how much love and kindness in our eyes and our voice we project, we cannot persuade a significant part of the capitalist class to behave any way differently than they do. Maybe some individuals will be exceptional, but if they conduct their business on the basis of human rights and the interests of the working class, they will lose out in the market, because the majority of the capitalists will not function in this way. They will undercut them, they will destroy them, they will remove them from the market, and the system will continue doing what it does best, and that is maximize profits at the expense of the working class. So the problem is the system. That's my premise. But I appreciate that there are people who have a different view. But these debates about the nature of the system have been going on for a couple hundred years. And the system has not changed except by means of revolution. So it may be an old strategy, but the idea of the status quo is even older and more riddled with failures and calamities, and offers us a future which is more dismal than ever, given the power and the destructive potential of the capitalist system today on a global scale. I want to go to the question of leadership. Why does the NDP behave the way that it does? First of all, it should be said clearly, in my view, the NDP is not a workers' party in the sense of a working class agenda, program, strategy. It's a capitalist party. But it's contradictory. The party was created by the farmers and union members in this country. So it embodies their aspirations. They want something better. But unfortunately, they have a leadership which is pro-capitalist, petty bourgeois, self-seeking, comfortable with the status quo. That's the contradiction. We as revolutionary socialists try to drive a wedge between that comfortable pro-capitalist leadership and the aspirations of the vast majority of their voters and members. We want to drive a wedge between them and to set the bottom against the top. This does not happen automatically. This happens only through socialist intervention in the mass working class organizations. If we had a mass revolutionary workers' party, a revolutionary communist party, a Marxist party in this country, we would be on the verge of socialist transformation of this society. But we're not there. How do we get there? We get there by involvement in the issues of the day, as I argued earlier and as John has ably argued and demonstrated today, and by building up a leadership that will be ready to provide a revolutionary strategy when the working class moves in its millions in anger and in greater political awareness about what its true aims and objectives are. How do we approach the current situation? I'm going to give a specific example and then I'm going to stop. There's a race now for NDP leadership. And you know that there are 6 or 5 registered candidates. To run for this leadership, you have to have a national profile, but more importantly, in the party system, in the NDP leadership race conducted by the party brass, you have to pay $30,000 and you have to collect hundreds of signatures all across the country, different categories of people. And it's also really important that you have not someone with high profile who is proficient in the 2 major languages of the country, French and English. So the radical left in the NDP does not have a candidate in this leadership race. We were promoting a former trade union leader in Ontario who considered the idea for some months, but then he pulled out. So what can we do in this situation? Well, it's difficult. It's a challenge. But do we just say, well, forget it, there's nothing we can do? No. As revolutionary socialists, we do everything that we can imagine might be positive. So we came up with 10 questions for these candidates, the 5 registered candidates for NDP leadership. I'm going to read to you just 2 so that you can understand what we're fighting for in the labor movement as well as in the party of the labor movement. 1, and here it is, I quote, about 235,000 Canadians become homeless every year with 35,000 sleeping in shelters and on the streets on any given night. 1.7 million are unable to afford adequate, suitable shelter. Do you commit, we say this to the candidates, do you commit that under your leadership the NDP will demand the construction of 500,000 quality social housing units by means of publicly owned land assembly and housing construction enterprises, not leaving it to the private sector? Public enterprises to create 500,000 quality housing units as soon as possible. That's one question. Second question, this has to do with workers who are increasingly precarious. The benefits of robotization, replacing workers with robots, and new technologies generally should be shared, not utilized to make the owners super rich and to drive more workers into poverty. Do you commit, we say these to the candidates, do you commit that under your leadership, the NDP will fight for a reduction in the work week without a loss in pay or benefits? Think about the radical implications of this idea. Society is very productive, wealth is unequally distributed, jobs are decreasing because of automation, advanced technology. We create the automation tools. They benefit. We lose. Is there something wrong with this picture? We create and we lose, they benefit. And there's also war from which they benefit. Because Canada is the 7th biggest exporter of weapons in the world. So we pose these questions, not because we think that the answers to these questions will be our path to liberation. It's to expose the contradiction between this party, which is pro-capitalist, and the aspirations of its class base, which is working class, which is socialist in its aspirations. If you think that there's a better way to move towards the building of a revolutionary party, we'd love to hear it. But if you think this offers a clue as to how we can move forward under the given conditions of today, with our given capacity, then you should join Socialist Action. And together, we'll put our minds together and think of even better tactics for the future.
There's something called survey. Whatever proposal or whatever idea or plan you have, you can run it through a cycle of survey to just sense the reaction of the public about your ideas, your proposals, and where it's going, where it's leading. Are you getting any support, or does your ideas make any sense to me? Or are they related to me, to my life? That's the biggest question. Poverty goes hand in hand with unemployment. Like the first stage is unemployment, second is you fall in with the poverty. With this kind of revolutionary ideas, who's going to create jobs? How are you going to manage 34.9 million people while you are bringing immigrants from the Philippines, from third world countries, and you pay them $9 and they're happily working and they can buy a house after 7 or 8 years with that kind of money? This is the contradiction. This is the kind of complicated situation we are dealing with. It's not a pure working productive class. There is no production in the nature of working class today. If you don't understand this, you're gonna, the train will leave you. Because 50 years ago, yes, you had mass production, you had working class with the unions. When they stopped one day working, millions of dollars were lost. But today is service. You gotta understand the nature of your base that you build your ideas on, then you can move forwards. I know it's a capitalism society, it's a pure capitalist society. I know it's neoliberalism, but again, you gotta ask yourself, why haven't you been able to rally that mass behind your ideas? Because you know why? Because this has been tried in the past. Mass public housing maintenance. Instead of mass public housing, why don't we focus on creating jobs? Why don't we creating in some programs, in social programs that lead to less poverties, instead of just, I don't know, I'm the contradicted, maybe I hold that ideas which doesn't go along with your ideas that you proposed here or fellow proposed here. But I think being in the heart of the people is
It has to be confronted. The problems of how to do that and how to build mass movements of resistance and how to build political leadership are enormous. But I think that fundamentally the analysis that I've tried to provide, I stand by, and I think it's correct. And I don't think there's a collaborative way around that. I think we're dealing with a reality that we've got to confront. And in doing so, we need to reach out to people. We need to understand what people think. We need to dialogue with people in all kinds of ways. But I don't think we can reduce the question of changing society to sort of like taking surveys of what people think. I think we have to put forward an agenda, and I think we have to fight for that agenda. And I believe that an agenda of resistance to austerity now is critical, and I also believe the only viable solution in this society is one in which, instead of having a handful of people own and control the productive wealth of society, there needs to be working class ownership, a generalized ownership.
In this case, we just changed this position from this hand to the other. Why wouldn't you?
It's a pretty important change of hand.
Yeah, but you know, it's going to be the same thing. You take it from a group and give it to another group, which is going to repeat itself. It's a philosophical debate.
No, I don't think it's a philosophical debate at all.
I think it is. You know why? Because you are doing the same thing that has been done, and people are. Sorry, I told you. I pulled back and you should talk. Sorry.
No. I mean, I'm sort of finished. But I think that at every point, going back to, I can think of examples going back to at least the 1920s. There's always been the argument that these ideas of class struggle and change are outdated, that there's new realities, that there's different ways of doing things. But fundamentally, we live in a class-divided society in which a tiny handful of exploiters own and control everything. And that is the fundamental crisis of humanity. That the fundamental way to change that is to have a society in which there is collective ownership, and in which the productive capacities of this society are subjected not to the control of the profit needs of a handful, but a rational, sane, just, democratic plan. And for that to happen, capitalism has to go. That remains my opinion, and I'm unrepentant in that regard. And if I'm anachronistic, I'll live with it.
So on an ending note, I would just like to make a comment of collective action that you were talking about and revolution that you were talking about, Barry. I don't know if anyone's heard of Joshua Wong. He is a student activist. He's been an activist since he's been 14 years old in Hong Kong. And he was fighting against national education. And it's very different than what we're talking about, but the point I'm trying to make is that he, with his activism, was able to draw out thousands of people from Hong Kong to, occupy a main highway in order to get a message across. And I think that if collectively we all get together as a society, then we also are able to make a change, but it has to be a group effort, right?
Yep.
So thank you so much, John Clarke, for your time, and on behalf of Deng Khan, I would like to thank you for coming here to speak to us. I would like to also thank Socialist Action for attending, and Amjad Ali for helping us, he's not here, for helping us rent this space. It's a good space to have this event. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great sharing.